Chapter 24. Blackbeard had changed only slightly since I'd seen him more than a year before, just a few miles away from where we stood facing each other in the middle of Topanga Canyon Boulevard. His fleecy, tousled hair hung to his waist. His smile was infectious. He said he'd rented a place up the canyon and invited me up there for breakfast. I followed him in my car. 5 miles back up the canyon, he turned up a steep side road to a small house built beneath a stand of oak trees and parked. Before going inside, we stood on the porch and smoked a joint. I told him about Charlie and the family and what I'd been doing. To my surprise, he knew a lot about the Manson family, firsthand. In July 1969, just after I had split for the desert, Blackbeard had inherited some money and had moved into Topanga Canyon with a friend named Bob Kasabian. A short time later, he met Bob's wife, Linda, who had just joined the family and who, on orders from Charlie, had ripped off Blackbeard for $5,000. When Blackbeard tried to get the money back, Charlie merely showed him the sword he'd used to chop off Gary Himon's ear. Blackbeard got the picture and a week later took off to South America. He'd only recently gotten back and was again living with Bob Kasabian. During the weeks which followed, I visited Blackbeard regularly, thereby adding another dimension to my fragmented state, another tendril of extended energy I could ill afford. When I confided to him the many roles I was playing, maintaining at the same time that I had faith that things were going the way they should, he said he wasn't surprised. He recalled the night we were busted at Half Moon Bay, saying, "I'd never seen anyone turn a scene around like you did that one. It was karma, man. The real McCoy. You blew those pigs' minds." In early February 1970, we were still living in the Chandler Street house during the week and repairing to spawns on the weekends to do music and unwind. I continued to confer with Charlie, to help arrange for attorneys, and to convey his messages to Leslie and Sadie. I was also in touch with Crockett and Poston by phone. About that time, Bruce Davis was arrested again and sent to Inyo County on charges of grand theft. I was subpoenaed and told that without my testimony, they couldn't hold him. I hitchhiked to Inyo with a new girl in the family named Ginny, who was carrying 24 tabs of acid, all but 2 of which were sewn into the lining of a sleeping bag. Squeaky had suggested we slip a tab of acid to Bruce during the trial. In part, it was a means of testing me. Charlie had told them to watch me closely. During the proceedings, while Don Ward sat with Crockett and Poston on one side and Ginny on the other, I took the Fifth Amendment, refusing to answer on the grounds that I might incriminate me. Stuber and Inyo's DA, Frank Fells, were furious. They needed the testimony to hold Davis. While they had interviews for me, which more than implicated Bruce Davis, they could not be used in court. Brooks and Crockett knew the game I was into, and they looked pretty dejected. It got even more insane when Ginny got up and, while passing in front of Bruce, slipped him a tab of acid in the courtroom. Bruce dropped it on the floor, but before anyone could react, he picked it up and ate it. A cop, meanwhile, seized Ginny's purse and found the other tab of acid. She was held for 2 days, then released. A few days later, they let Bruce go, and my loyalty to the family was, for the time being, reconfirmed. In the meantime, the scene had been set for my sexual number with Squeaky. It was never talked about directly, but the promptings were there. A feeling that the family would benefit by such a consummation of power. It happened one afternoon at the Chandler Street house. I'd been at court all morning and had just returned to change clothes. While I was changing, Squeaky entered the bedroom and flopped down on the bed. She was talking about how great things were going, that Charlie was going to walk. The Free Press was taking up the cause. This was during the time that Bernadine Dorn told a convention of students for a democratic society, offing those rich pigs with their own forks and knives and eating a meal in the same room. Far out. The Weathermen dig Charles Manson. It was also at the height of Charlie's flamboyant courtroom theatrics when he wore embroidered shirts, kept his hair combed, and paraded around the courtroom like a peacock. I walked by Squeaky, telling her to follow me into the other bedroom. I heard her giggle as she waltzed in behind me, removed her blouse, and tossed it on a chair. I'd all but forgotten the day at Barker's when I'd seen Charlie bring Squeaky out of an epileptic seizure following sex. And I was momentarily stunned when, after making love to her, she began to shake and convulse. Within minutes, she had lost all control. It was as if her entire being had been reduced to a quivering mass of jelly. Then her body stiffened and she clenched her fists until her knuckles turned white. Her head thrashed from side to side. "It's okay, Lynn," I said. "It's okay. It's Paul. Just relax." I climbed on top of her and grabbed her by the wrists. "Oh, whoa," she moaned. "Ugh." Her breathing came in short gasps and pants. Go ahead, I said. "Tighten your fingers." "Yeah, good. Tighter. No, tighter. Now relax them. Relax. Now tighten. Relax. Tighten." Using the method I had seen Charlie employ, I was able to settle her down, but it wasn't easy. By the time I'd calmed her, we were both exhausted. Afterward, we drove to Spawn's, and Squeaky behaved as if nothing had happened. But the incident stayed with me, a graphic expression of the control mechanism Charlie had implanted in Squeaky, and by which he had been able to dominate both her mind and body. After that episode, things happened fast. Later that same week, I was coming out of the court building when a dapper little guy, sporting a goatee and dressed in a double-breasted suit, approached me, saying he was a lawyer and wanted to ask me a few questions. I walked with him to a chauffeured limousine, and we drove up to Hollywood. He introduced himself as Jake Friedberg, saying that he just wanted some information about the family, and that he'd make it worth my while to provide it. He'd asked if I'd mind staying at the Continental Hyatt House for a couple of days, and when I said no, he made a reservation for me in the penthouse. I spent 2 days there telling him what I knew. On the morning of the third day, as I was leaving the hotel, I was paged to the phone. It was Crockett. I called him the day I arrived and left my number. His voice was hard and clear, like a pick against granite. "Where the hell have you been?" "Nowhere." "I've been trying to get you. DA's office called us up and said that Freebird is a mafia man. Something about La Bianca's connection with the syndicate. He say anything about it?" "No." There was a long pause. Then Crockett spoke. "Where are you trying to take yourself anyway? Oblivion?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. "When you coming out to the desert?" "It won't be long." I waited for Freebird to come back, but he didn't, and I never saw him again. A couple of days later, we moved out of the Chandler Street house and back to Spawn's. George had mellowed out enough to let us move in again on a permanent basis. The day after we moved back, Clem was released on bail and joined the rest of us in a small wooden structure built just beyond Randy Starr's trailer, a beautifully symmetrical building we called the Storybook House. The day we moved in, I was standing on the boardwalk with Sandy when a car with 2 men in it pulled up beside me and stopped. "You Watkins?" driver asked. I nodded. Both men got out of the car. Both wore sports jackets and gray fedoras. One of them had on sunglasses. They asked if we could talk, and I led them into the saloon, where Squeaky and Brenda were sitting on the floor working on Charlie's vest. "We'll make it fast," the shorter of the two men said. "We hear Charlie wants to be sprung." "Huh?" Brenda stood up. "We don't know nothing about that. Where'd you hear that?" The man looked at Squeaky, his eyes on mine. "So what's the deal?" I don't know anything about it. And I didn't. The two looked at each other. Then the short one grinned. "Well, that's cool. Just forget it ever happened." They walked out, climbed in their car, and drove away. To this day, I have no idea what their visit was all about. That same week, a motion for discovery was made by the defense, and all the prosecution's evidence, including my statements, was turned over to Charlie and his ever-changing team of lawyers. I had known this would happen eventually, but I didn't think it would be that soon. I would later learn that on the very day Charlie was presented with those documents, we at Spawn's had set things up for an acid trip to celebrate our return to the ranch. It was rather chilly the night we gathered inside the saloon to play music and smoke a little grass. I had Mark Ross pass out the acid, and we all dropped at the same time. It was good acid, and we each took one tab, sitting at the head of the circle on a pillow, with Sandy and Brenda on one side and Squeaky on the other. I felt as though I had assumed control. I sensed at once that Kevin and Mark were uptight. I signaled for Cappy and Ginny to move closer to Mark. We all joined hands and I initiated some motion into the circle. It was then that I saw Mark's eyes kind of roll back in his head. I knew we might lose him if I didn't intervene. I knelt in front of him and raised his hands, setting his palms against mine. "Hey, Mark. Hey, man, don't fade away on us." I began exerting a slight pressure against his arms until he met the pressure with some resistance. When he did, I gave in to his motion, then applied pressure again. Pretty soon our hands began moving in a series of synchronized movements. I watched his eyes and saw he was coming around. The motion was bringing him around. I'd seen Charlie do the same thing countless times. Pretty soon, everyone was tripping out on me and Mark. Finally, he looked me dead in the eye. As he spoke, so did I. The words we said were the same words. "Are you doing that? Or am I?" Afterward, we all made love, then lay around rapping and listening to music. Sometime before dawn, we heard 3 vehicles pull up in front of the saloon. Brenda blew out the candles, and Mark and I laid a crossbeam across the door. We could hear the static from squad car radios and the cops as they climbed out of their cars and began flashing their lights along the boardwalk. "Go down by the corral and take a look," one of them said. "We'll take a peek up this way." The boardwalk creaked as they clomped past the saloon toward the tack room. "Check the back door," I whispered to Cappy. She walked quietly to the rear of the saloon, then came back beside me. "It's locked," she said. "Somebody must have told them we moved back here." Had they wanted, the cops could have gotten inside, but in listening to them, you got the feeling that they really didn't want to. Finally, they convened in front of the saloon, got in their cars, and split. The next morning, though I was scheduled to appear in court on a traffic violation, I accompanied Clem to the Hall of Justice. He, too, had to appear in court. It was a simple procedure. He merely wanted to change attorneys, substituting Day Shin, at Charlie's suggestion, for Charles Holopeter. All that was required of Clem was a one-word answer: yes. But by then, Steve Grogan was pretty far gone. When he finally was called before the judge, he stood there dumbly, with a leering grin on his face, his hair disheveled across his forehead. "Mr. Grogan, the court is informed that you no longer wish Mr. Charles Hollipeter to represent you. That you have decided upon Mr. Day Shin as your new acting attorney. Is that true?" Clam turned and looked at the girls who were seated among the spectators. "Is that true?" the judge repeated. "Huh?" Clem muttered. "Young man, I am talking to you. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Huh?" Clem blurted again. The judge then asked Clem to be taken next door and examined for being under the influence of drugs. 45 minutes later, he was escorted into the courtroom again, it being determined that he was not under the influence of any kind of drug or stimulant. When the judge repeated the question, however, Clem's response was the same. We asked for a recess and I took Clem outside. "Look, man, all you gotta do is say one word. Yes. When he asks you if you want Day Shin, you say yes." "Huh?" he repeated. Finally, I just reared back and slapped him full in face with the flat of my hand and shouted his name. "Steve! Steve, what the fuck is the matter?" His eyes fluttered and he looked at me. "What's the matter?" I repeated. "Where the hell have you been? You okay?" "Sure. You want to keep Hollipeter or do you want Day Shin?" "I'd rather have Shin. He seems to know more what's happening." When court reconvened, we went back inside and he told the judge he wanted Day Shin. Seeing Clem so completely dodoed out that morning unnerved me. He played the idiot so long that he literally became an idiot. All his responses were idiot responses. Implants by Charlie. Steve Grogan had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. Why this particular episode jolted me so, I don't know. But unless it was the realization that my own idiocy was no less blatant, I didn't go back to Spawn's that afternoon. Instead, I drove out to Topanga Canyon to visit Blackbeard and spent the night there. The following morning, I appeared before the judge for my traffic violation. Brenda and Squeaky went with me. Since I'd failed to show on 2 previous occasions, the old man was in no mood for excuses and fined me $65 or 5 days in jail. I asked the girls to go out to the car and get some money I'd stashed under the dashboard. Then they went out and didn't come back. And I spent 5 days in the cooler, not knowing that Charlie had already given the girls copies of my statements to the DA. Charles Manson had spent 23 years in prison. To me, 5 days seemed an eternity, particularly since I knew I'd pushed my own games to their limit. Though I was in a cell with 6 other guys, half of them murder cases on appeal, the others alcoholics, I felt totally and utterly alone. I thought about the others in jail. I thought about what going to prison actually meant. I thought about Snake, sitting in a mental ward. I would later see a transcript of a statement she'd made to the police. When asked who she was, she replied, "I am a butterfly in a flower palace. I live on a sea of sand." Perhaps for the first time, I began to see what was happening. Not the sensationalism, the publicity, the theory, the great spectacle that was being created to glut the public's craving for meaning and justice. What I saw was the truth, that the distance between good and evil is short, that the fine line between sanity and insanity is one we all walk, that I was on the brink of self-destruction. Around me were 4 walls and barred windows, and men who, in the face of life, preferred to stay drunk. I was released early in the morning, sometime around the end of March, and immediately hitchhiked up to Spawn's. 5 nights of insomnia had left me completely obliterated. Sandy, Brenda, and Squeaky were there, waiting with copies of my statements to the police. "What is this shit?" Squeaky shouted, springing to her feet. "What?" I mumbled. "Your goddamn testimony to the Inyo County pigs." "It's the truth. It's the truth. Charlie always said we had nothing to hide. The truth will set you free." "It didn't set you free, did it?" Brenda lashed out. "You want to be free?" Sandy asked. "Judas! You're a Judas! Get fucked!" I walked out of the saloon and up to the storybook house. I grabbed the keys to Mark's van, then trotted up the trail toward the outlaw shacks where it was parked. I didn't know where I was going, but I was getting the hell out of L.A. I stopped in Chatsworth and put some gas in the car, then headed for Topanga Canyon, deciding to see Blackbeard before I split. I was completely disoriented, feeling disgust one moment, anguish the next. My entire being seemed molten, slippery, and out of control, as though all levels of consciousness belonged to the sea, to its currents, its waves, its vastness. I felt like some hapless sailing vessel on the brink of a storm. Part of it was exhaustion. Part of it was I reached the end and the beginning at the same time. Chapter 25. But Jesus said unto him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? Judas, looking back, I see that my relationship to Charlie was that like Judas to Christ. Christ needed a Judas. Together they made the legend. Someone had to tell the story. Someone had to tip off the law. Of all the disciples, only Judas tried to explain what Christ was preaching, but they wouldn't buy Christ's blasphemous statements. I and my Father are one. Christ was seized, tried, and crucified. But Judas never lived to witness the crucifixion. He hanged himself the night before. I parked my car in front of Blackbeard's place and went inside. Blackbeard wasn't there, but Bob was. I didn't feel like telling him what had happened, so I remained quiet while he discussed the trial. He said Linda's testimony would be enough to get Charlie and the others convicted. He said Linda had gotten her head together and was ready to tell everything. He said if I agreed to testify, Charlie's goose will be cooked. I listened for a while, then went out to the van. It was dark by then. I lit a joint and turned on Mark's stereo and lay down on the bed in the back. I guess that's when I fell asleep. Sometime around midnight, I woke up gagging. The inside of the van was filled with smoke. Flames were licking up around the front seat. I tried to kick open the rear door, but it wouldn't budge. The smell of burning plastic and enamel permeated the air. My lungs sputtered. There was no oxygen, only the toxic, white-hot smoke which funneled into my throat. I tried to scream, but the sounds were muted, choked off in guttural groans. I smashed my fist through one of the side windows, but the cold air only fanned the flames, bringing them closer. For what seemed like minutes, I remained in a state of panic, continuing to kick at the rear door while my mind lapsed into a slow, reeling, kaleidoscopic rerun of deaths by fire. It was like the freak out all over again. I felt the hairs on my body being singed. The smell sent me into convulsions and I vomited, choking on my sickness, feeling as though I was about to die again. Finally, an impulse prompted me to dive headlong through the flames onto the front seat. I kicked open the door and rolled out onto the ground, then got up and raced to the house to wake Bob and Blackbeard. By the time the ambulance arrived, I was in shock. Blackbeard had wrapped me in a blanket. I stood in the corner of the living room asking for morphine, but they didn't understand me. They couldn't. My vocal cords had been burned to a crisp. Blackbeard rode with me to the hospital. I remember that. I remember him sitting next to me. "You're gonna be okay, Paul. You're gonna be okay." As it turned out, the nightmare of that experience was just beginning. It took over an hour for them to admit me to a bed in the emergency room of the Santa Monica Hospital. Since I couldn't talk, Blackbeard had to interpret. I wrote down my parents' phone number, but that wasn't enough. Before the hospital did anything, they wanted to be certain I had medical insurance. By that time, I'd given up on trying to communicate and just lay back, feeling more pain than I could ever remember having felt. The next thing I remember was being given a shot of morphine and being wheeled into a room. There were 2 nurses hovering around me when I felt blisters forming on my throat and started choking. "Pop the bubbles," I gabbed. "Pop the bubbles!" But the sounds were garbled and they didn't understand. "What?" "The bubbles!" I pointed to my throat. "He's going into convulsions," one of them said. No, pop the bubbles." Then a doctor appeared and ordered them to prepare for a tracheotomy. No, I wailed. That's when I started to vomit again, but it was mainly dry heaves. I tried to swallow hard and make the bubbles pop myself. I tried to force my tongue down on the bubbles, but it wouldn't reach. I stuck a finger in my mouth, but the nurses jerked my hand away. "Pop the bubbles! Pop the bubbles!" A little cart was wheeled in. My eyes were puffy and swollen. All the hair had been singed off my face. I could scarcely see, and it hurt to keep my eyes open. But I saw the scalpel and the hypodermic needle, and I knew they intended to cut my throat. No! I kicked and thrashed while one of the nurses held a pan under my chin to catch the puke. "Please try and hit the tray," she said primly. I kicked at her, but someone grabbed my legs. 2 dudes had been called in to strap me down. "He's hysterical. Hurry!" They pinned one arm down, but before they could grab the other, I seized one of the surgical instruments, shoved the butt end of it down my throat, and popped the bubbles. I remained unconscious 3 days. When I woke up, my mother was sitting beside me, cutting what remained of my hair. She said everything was going to be okay, and for me to rest. She said, too, that my brothers and sisters were waiting to see me. So were Paul Crockett and Brooks Poston. I remember seeing Crockett and Brooks, but I don't remember what they said to me. The next day, my parents took me home to Thousand Oaks. During the week I spent at my folks', reporters and police continued to call and come by in droves. My parents kept them away. I couldn't talk anyway. Fate works with the psyche in mysterious ways. At the very time I am asked to testify in court in front of Charlie before the world, I am rendered voiceless. Perhaps I had programmed myself, driven unconsciously to the outer limits of several realities at once. The questions were obvious ones. Did the family try to kill me? Were my actions impulses, as Juan had suggested, suicidal? Or was it an accident? Clem later boasted that it was he who tried to kill me. In light of other murders and murder attempts, it would appear a very good possibility. But I don't believe it. Even if it were true, the responsibility was mine. I drove myself into that situation as a means of coming to grips with a game I knew could not go on. Perhaps it was inevitable. I took myself to a place where there was no voice. The voice I burned was not mine. It was Charlie's, the family's. It was Crockett's, the man's. It was the voice of society. Those voices had to go up in flames. The voice I needed if I ever were to survive was my own voice. After a week, I left Thousand Oaks and flew to Monterey, then headed down the coast to Big Sur. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to sit on the edge of the cosmos and watch the sea in silence. For several days, I hiked through mountains around Esalen, stopping once to visit my sister, who was preparing to go to Chile with a group she helped organize called Erica. I hiked along the same trails Blackbeard and I had once traveled, and I stopped at Garrapatta Canyon long enough to take a peek at Kevin's house. But I didn't go in. I didn't want to. By the middle of March, I decided to go back to Shoshone. The day I got there, Crockett, Juan, and Brooks took me to Las Vegas and bought me a steak dinner with all the trimmings. They didn't talk much about the fire, but I sensed what they were thinking. They talked about the music scene they were putting together, plans to do gigs in towns throughout the desert. We laughed and told stories, and they showed me the depth of their friendship. Crockett found it amusing that I couldn't talk, insisting, when I did manage to rasp out a gibberish or inarticulate uttering, that my singing had improved immensely. They didn't tell me that night that the DA's office had been calling them regularly, asking them to exert pressures on me to testify in the Tate LaBianca trials. At that point, I didn't want to testify. I had a perfect excuse. I couldn't talk. By that time, the retrial of Bobby Beausoleil for the murder of Hinman was in progress. Mary Brunner, in exchange for complete immunity, became the chief prosecution witness, testifying that she had seen Bobby stab Hinman to death. Bobby, meanwhile, put the finger on Charlie. But the jury believed Mary. While this was happening, Charlie was busy juggling lawyers, not just his, but Sadie's and Leslie's as well. In May, he acquired the services of Irving Kennerek. Judge William Keene, meanwhile, who had presided over the preliminary trials, was replaced by Judge Charles W. Older. By the middle of June, they began the long process of selecting a jury for the Tate LaBianca trials. My feelings during that period fluctuated. The trauma of the fire stayed with me. At times I woke up at night in a cold sweat, in a state of utter panic. I was high-strung and subject to fits of convulsive crying, torrential outpourings which carried away the sledge of repression which had locked me away from my feelings and from seeing the stark horror of an evil I had been part of. The fire had burned away the facade. I was left face to face with myself. The pain of that never left me entirely. While Juan had talked about testifying, he was undecided. None of us gave advice one way or the other. Meanwhile, we worked on our music. Though I couldn't talk, much less sing, I could play the flute. Brooks had become something of a virtuoso on the guitar. Juan was dynamite on the conga drums. In early June, we did a gig in Lone Pine, calling ourselves the Minstrel's Magic. A week later, we were hired to play at a place in Tacopa. For the first time in months, I began writing songs. Songs for the new voice I didn't yet possess. One night, we were lounging in the living room by the fire. We'd worked all day laying a pipeline for the gas company. Crockett, as usual, was dealing cards to himself. Juan was writing a letter. Brooks had gone to Tacopa to pick up the amplifiers we'd left there the week before. I'd begun groaning about the fact that I still had no voice, that it looked like I'd have to be content to just play music, not sing it. Crockett glanced up from his cards. You ever decide to get your voice back? Decide? Well, if you ain't decided, are you sure you even want your voice back? He scooped up the cards and shuffled them. Maybe you'll want to just leave that voice behind. Get you a new voice. Or did you like the old one? I gawked at Crockett. If you want a different voice, might as well. You ain't got one now. Why not decide on that? Decide on the kind you want. One for singing and talking. Figure out what style you want, low, high. Once you decide and picture it in your mind, just relax and it'll come. Juan grinned. Way it is now, Crockett intoned, you're holding up the show. We got a singing group here. Like to have it complete. See what I mean? That night, I decided to get a new voice. I pictured and felt the voice I wanted in my mind's eye. A few days later, while trying to sing in the shower, my wheezy, disjointed raspings began to give way to sound. The first fledgling tones of my new voice. Moments later, I was belting out a song I'd written called, Is It That You Recall? I was exultant as I dried off, wrapping a towel around my waist, and strutted into the living room, where Crockett and Brooks were seated on the floor, rewiring the amplifier. Well, Crockett said, glancing up at me, then at Brooks. It ain't Caruso, but what the hell? Shortly after that episode, on a windy afternoon, when Crockett and I were in Shoshone buying groceries, we ran into Clem, Gypsy, and Mark Ross riding around in a Jeep. We had just crossed the street when they pulled up alongside us. Got a message for you piggies, Clem barked. Charlie says when he gets out, you better not be around the desert. I glanced at Gypsy, and she stared back with all the vehemence she could muster. She looked pathetic. Clem, his hair scrambled and windblown around his ghoulish face, looked even more ridiculous. Suddenly, the pent-up rage and resistance I had felt for so long fell away, into a kind of clarity. I knew that I'd testify in front of a jury, in front of Charles Manson, in front of the devil himself, and that I'd tell the truth. The same afternoon, I wrote a letter to the DA's office, to Stovitz and Bugliosi, telling them I would testify for the prosecution. Later that night, I took a walk downtown with Juan. I told him about the letter, but he didn't say anything. Oddly enough, in all the time we'd known each other, Juan and I had never shared the information we had on the family. I mentioned that to Juan, saying, let's not discuss it now either. Let's just go down there and tell the truth. There's just been too much dying. Charlie's trip is nothing but death. Juan agreed to testify, and so did Brooks. It was an agreement that would commit us to an odyssey of trials that lasted more than 9 years. Best thing for you, Crockett said when we told him. Them trials will be like a deprogramming process. You're gonna have to remember specific incidents and tell them to lawyers who'd like nothing better than to make you look dumb, crazy, or drugified. And you can't fake it, 'cause they all got it on them transcripts. You can't remember what you told one guy. You just remember the incident and tell the truth. And that will serve to bring your mind through all those things again, and you get free of them. And with Charlie sitting right there looking at you, it will finally cut you loose. The truth will set you free, I muttered distractedly. Exactly, Crockett said. We weren't called to testify that summer, but we followed the progress of the trial and all of Charlie's antics and manipulations. We saw photos of Weish, Sandy, Cappy, Squeaky, and Gypsy sitting on the sidewalks, their heads shaved, their foreheads carved with Charlie's stamp, just as their souls had been. From time to time we received telephone threats, but it did nothing to alter our decision to testify. Linda Kasabian's testimony alone was devastating for Charlie, but he continued to operate, manipulating lawyers, judges, the jury. Meanwhile, people continued to disappear and to die. People like Ronald Hughes, Leslie's lawyer. But those stories have been told. The story of a murder attempt on Barbara Hoyt. The story of Charlie lunging at Judge Older with a sharpened pencil in his hand. Whether in or out of jail, Charles Manson was dangerous. The prospect of facing him in court was not pleasant. But in a strange, ironic way, I was looking forward to it. To me, it was a part of the destiny of my relationship with Charlie, and the only way to really sever that relationship once and for all. In September, when Tex was finally extradited to California, I told Crockett in Boston that I wanted to see him. We drove to LA the next day and met with him for over an hour. If I had any doubts whatsoever about testifying, seeing Tex removed them. Sitting before us, he looked emaciated, his skin and bone like a torture victim at Dachau. His eyes were lifeless. The prosecution would later claim that Tex was faking it, that he was trying to cop an insanity plea. But I knew Tex Watson, and he wasn't faking anything. He was paying for the crimes he had committed. If I've ever seen a specimen of a living death, it was Tex. When we asked him what really happened at the murder scenes, he told us. He didn't explain. He just narrated the events in monotone as they happened. The bodies of the Tate and LaBianca victims have received a total of 159 stab wounds. Most of them had been inflicted by him. I just killed them. That's what I had to do. I heard Sadie cry, "Help me," and I helped her. It seemed like there was a lot of time between events. Then Katie needed help and I helped her. It seemed like I had to do everything. And then it was over. As we were walking out to the Jeep, Brooks remarked to Crockett that Tex might as well just die, 'cause he'd never be able to get that horror out of his head. Crockett just grunted. It was clear that seeing Tex Watson had disturbed him too. "I don't know," Brooks said, looking at me. "I remember just after Charlie came up to Barker's, after the murders. I was sitting in the bunkhouse and he come in and said he'd been looking for me, and the only time he could talk any sense to me was when Big Paul wasn't around. He takes out the knife and says to me, 'You know, it might be a good idea for you to take this knife, go to Shoshone, and kill that motherfucking Sheriff Ward.' What'd you say?" Something like, "Yeah, far out." But I was thinking in there, looking at Tex. What if he had stayed at Barker's and met Crockett instead of me? Brooks glanced at Crockett, who climbed into the Jeep and fired up the engine. I sat in the back while Brooks, seated on the passenger side, faced me, his eyes squinting. I mean, shit. If I'd never met Crockett or come to the desert, I'd still be like a junkie hooked on Charlie. Who knows? I might have taken that knife. I might have wound up where Tex is now. Chapter 26. Is it that you recall being in harmony? Is there something in you that yearns to see? Or do you remember a time when you were free? Did you ever wonder what you're living for? Is there anything of which you are sure? Have you asked yourself, is there more? A moment's moment can be an eternity, and all the while time has its flow. So how many lifetimes can you live in infinity? It's all there for us to know. Song by Paul Watkins, summer of 1970. The book Helter Skelter chronicles events that took place during the Tate LaBianca trials. The saga of a murder case which lasted longer, received more publicity, and cost more than any other in American history. For me to repeat what was written there would be wasted effort. I can only conclude my own story, which is a part of that saga, a single thread in a legal tapestry which will not be forgotten. I saw Charles Manson for the last time in a courtroom in the LA Hall of Justice in the fall of 1972. I saw him face to face, not 20 feet away, across an odyssey of time and circumstances that, in retrospect, seems totally unbelievable. What happened that day in the midst of my testimony, when Charlie leaped to his feet and screamed, "Liar!" must remain indelible to all those who bore witness to it. For me, it was a catharsis, a moment of utter unwavering certainty, as inevitable as the dawning of a new day. Yet, by the time it happened, I was prepared. By then, I had testified not only in the Tate LaBianca trials and the grand jury proceedings, but also in Tex Watson's trial and the Shay Hinman trials. I had spent weeks on the witness stand and had been asked the same questions time and time again. I had been examined and cross-examined by some of the best defense attorneys in Los Angeles, including Charlie's most tenacious counselor, Irving Kanarek. I had been referred to as a robot, drug addict, pimp, thief, social misfit. But through the process of concentration and a commitment to remembering the truth in court, I was able, as Crockett had foreseen, one step at a time, to deprogram myself from the subtle yet profound effects of Charles Manson's philosophy, so that when my final showdown with Charlie came, I welcomed it. From the beginning, the courtroom had served as a theater for some of Manson's best performances. Even those who wanted his blood could not help but be struck by his spirited charisma. Early in the Tate LaBianca proceedings, Joseph Ball, the former president of the State Bar Association and former senior counsel to the Warren Commission, found Charlie to be an able, intelligent young man, quiet-spoken and mild-mannered. He remarked further that Charlie had a ready understanding of the law and a fine brain. Ball said, too, that Charlie was not resentful against society. He feels if he goes to trial, he's able to permit jurors in the court to hear him and see him. They will realize he is not the kind of man who could perpetrate horrible crimes. Following Ball's remarks, the then presiding judge, William Keene, begged Charlie to reconsider his decision to defend himself. But Charlie wouldn't budge. "For all my life," he said, "as long as I can remember, I've taken your advice. Your faces have changed, but it's the same court, the same structure. All my life I've been put in little slots, Your Honor, and I went along with it. I have no alternative but to fight you back any way I know how, because you and the district attorney and all the attorneys I have met are on the same side, and the newspapers are on the same side, and it's all pointed against me personally. No, I haven't changed my mind." But Charlie didn't defend himself long. His courtroom antics in violation of procedure, much of which was done to play up to the press, forced the judge to appoint an attorney, Charles Holopeter, with the stipulation that Charlie could enlist another attorney if he so desired. Along the way, Charlie would make many substitutions, selecting, at last, Irving Kennerek. From December 1969 until July 1970, when the Tate LaBianca trials finally got underway, Charlie called most of the shots, both in and out of the courtroom. And in the beginning, both when he had the support of the free press and radicals like Jerry Rubin, he put on a real show. Together with the girls who came to court daily and kept vigil on the sidewalks of L.A., Broadway, and Temple, Manson was able to hold his own on the battleground of what he called injustice. But the evidence and testimony against Charlie, Sadie, Katie, Leslie, and Tex mounted. But neither Charlie nor the girls gave up, and we were continually threatened. I was entering the courtroom one morning when Squeaky approached me just outside the doorway of the Hall of Justice. It was in September, around the time I was to begin my testimony. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm just telling the truth. It's time to tell the truth." "Are you still my brother?" "Yeah, I'm your brother." "Listen to your love." "That's what I'm doing, Lynn." "There is no such thing as death," she muttered. "It's all love." "Here, Lynn." I took a 5-carat emerald ring off my little finger and handed it to her. Then I walked into the courtroom. Nearly 3 years later to the day, September 5th, 1975, in Sacramento, California's City of Justice, Lynette Squeaky Fromme attempted to assassinate the President of the United States. My testimony, together with that of Brooks and Wan, not only substantiated the murder charges against Charlie — he had admitted killing Shorty to each of us separately — but provided corroboration of Helter Skelter, the race war as a motive. We had all experienced Charlie's programming techniques and were thus able to convey, at least in part, how Charlie's devices operated. On cross-examination, the defense continually sought to invalidate my testimony by suggesting that drugs had destroyed my mind. During the Bruce Davis trial, Shay Hinman, after I had testified to hearing Bruce describe the murder of Shorty Shay, the defense attorney approached the bench. "Your Honor, it is my intention to show that this witness has, over a period of time involved in his testimony, been engaged almost continually in the taking of drugs, that he has acknowledged on examination and cross-examination in prior cases that he has taken LSD, and this, as a result, has his mind been bent." Hours and hours were spent grilling us on drugs, everything from acid to marijuana. The numerous transcripts of trial testimony read very much alike. From the Shay Hinman trial, February 1972. Question: "And now, Mr. Watkins, how about marijuana? What are the effects on you of marijuana?" Answer: "On me?" Question: "On you, sir." Answer: "You get high, or what I would call high. Kind of happy, laughing, feel free, feel good." Question: "Is this after just one, or does it take several?" Answer: "It depends on how strong it is, and how strong you are, who you are with, and what you are doing, and it depends on a lot of things." Question: "All right, how about hashish?" Answer: "It just has the same effect, only much stronger." Question: "Much faster?" Answer: "Much faster." Question: "And when you say much stronger, does it affect your balance?" Answer: It depends on the type of hashish you're smoking. I never had it affect my balance, like I suppose you're likening it to being drunk, where you are stumbling around. It's not like that, though. Question. Does it affect your sense of time? Answer. Inasmuch as though you may be having a good time, and time would seem to fly. Question. Does it affect your sense of vision? Answer. Not really. Question. It doesn't enhance or detract from your ability to see, is that right? Answer. Well, I may have had it enhance my ability to see at times and detract at other times. Question. Does it cause you to have any sort of visions or hallucinations at all? Answer. No. Question. Does it cause sounds to be more keenly aware of sounds or sights? Answer. You're still talking about marijuana and hashish, right? Question. Right. Answer. Yeah. On certain occasions it would. You would be more aware of sounds and sights. Question. Well, other than that, does it happen to do anything to you? Answer. Other than what? Question. Those things we've named. Answer. Well, I don't know how deep you want to get into it, but we could leave it right there. If it's okay with you, it's okay with me. When attempts to discredit me failed along those lines, the defense tried other means. At one point during the same trial, the defense lawyer approached the bench to tell the judge he could prove that I was working with the police, and that, therefore, my testimony was prejudicial and biased. Out of earshot of the jury, he explained to the judge what I clearly overheard. I will offer proof that between October and December, specifically in mid-December of 1969, this particular witness had several conversations with Officer Dave Stuber and other officers of the Highway Patrol in the Sheriff's Department in Inyo County. That thereafter, and as a part of the plan of prosecution, he returned to the Manson family, to the Swan Ranch, specifically sent there to be a spy. That he saw Charles Manson in January, approximately 8 times at the jail, which visits are recorded, and that I contend that this was done specifically to get information to pass along to the sheriff, that therefore this testimony is biased and prejudiced because of his connections with the prosecution based on this background. Though none of these assertions were true, I felt as though, at times, I were on trial. Question. Well, did you visit Charlie at least 7 or 8 times in January of 1970 in jail? Is that correct? Answer. At least. Question. All right, and these were just friendly visits to pass the time of the day, to help poor old Charlie while away the hours? The state's attorney at the time, Manzella, objected, and the objection was sustained. Question. Well, were these friendly visits to help your friend, who was there in great trouble? Answer. Some. Manzella objected, and the court sustained it. Question. All right, sir, Denny went on. These were visits in order for you to try and pump Charles Manson for the prosecution. Isn't that right? Answer. No, that isn't right. Often I felt totally exasperated. I wanted to tear through the mumbo-jumbo of the courtroom decorum. I wanted to explain to the court, to the judge, the jury, and everyone present the real truth, the torment, the depth of feeling, the reality of my experience, which seemed inaccessible and paradoxically out of place in what has been called the halls of justice, that I had learned the courtroom games well, and focusing energy on the truth enabled me to outlast the most determined defense attorneys. The mind games played in a courtroom are complex, and it takes a good deal of awareness to stay on top of them. It's not simply a matter of telling the truth, since everything you say is controlled by the questions, and that many of the questions are asked obliquely so that the intent of the lawyers is not always clear. Plus, your consciousness must encompass not only the attorneys on both sides, but also the jury and the judge. But it was neither the judge nor the jury that made testifying traumatic. It was facing the defendants. It's hard to describe the multitude of feelings I had when taking the stand as a witness for the prosecution, facing Charlie, Sadie, Leslie, and Katie in the courtroom eye to eye. Facing girls who had once had beauty in their hearts. Girls I knew better than any jury would ever know. Girls I had lived with, traveled with, made love with, sung with. All of them on trial for murder. And the man who had taught me a great deal about music and love had asked me to submit to that love. A man I had once seen as the embodiment of life, who had become its opposite, but who nevertheless continued to project incredible force and presence even late in the Tate LaBianca proceedings, after Brooks and I had testified. Clean-shaven, well-groomed and articulate, he made a great spectacle, prancing confidently around the courtroom. According to Charlie, it was not he who was on trial, but the system which brought him there. And in part, he was right. Near the end of the Tate LaBianca trial, when it was clear that the evidence against him was insurmountable, he took the stand to testify on his own behalf. Even Bugliosi, who had fought so hard to secure the death penalty, admitted to the hypnotic effect of Manson's words. And Bugliosi had not met Charles Manson at 18, before the murders, during the summer of love, when the youth of America were riding the crest of an awakening consciousness and were high on life and LSD. But I had, and I had come a long way since then, far enough at least to see through Charlie's impassioned soliloquy, shot through the truths and half-truths and the subtle nuances of his madness. Yet, even when Charlie spoke, he spoke for more than an hour. What he said was not only for the benefit of the court, but to manipulate the other defendants. His family, still programmed to loyalty to the bitter end, ready to die for a man who could have just as easily cut their throats. Charlie's testimony began slowly, but as he spoke, his voice became clear and resonant. If Charles Manson was anything, he was a performer. Most of the people at the ranch that you called a family were just the people you didn't want. People that were alongside the road, that their parents had kicked out, that they did not want to go to juvenile hall. So I did the best I could and took them up on my garbage dump. And I told them this, that in love there is no wrong. I told them that anything they do for their brothers and sisters is good if they do it with a good thought. I was working at cleaning up my house, something that Nixon should have been doing. He should have been on the side of the road picking up his children, but he wasn't. He was in the White House, sending them off to war. I don't understand you, but I don't try. I don't try to judge anybody. I know that the only person I can judge is me. But I know this, that in your hearts and your own souls, you are just as responsible for the Vietnam War as I am for killing these people. I can't judge any of you, but I will say this to you. You haven't got long before you are all going to kill yourselves, because you are all crazy. And you can project it back at me. But I am only what lives inside each and every one of you. My father is the jailhouse. My father is your system. I am only what you made me. I am only a reflection of you. I have ate out of your garbage cans to stay out of jail. I have wore your second-hand clothes. I have done my best to get along in your world, and now you want to kill me. And I look at you, then I say to myself, you want to kill me? I am already dead. Have been all my life. I've spent 23 years in tombs that you built. Sometimes I think about giving it back to you. Sometimes I think about just jumping on you and letting you shoot me. If I could, I would jerk this microphone off and beat your brains out with it. Because that is what you deserve. That is what you deserve. You expect to break me? Impossible. You broke me years ago. You killed me years ago. You can do anything you want with me, but you cannot touch me because I am my love. If you put me in the penitentiary, that means nothing because you kicked me out of the last one. I didn't ask to be released. I liked it in there because I like myself. On April 19th, 1971, Judge William Older sentenced Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten to die. 10 months later, February 1972, the death penalty in California was abolished, and their sentences were reduced to life imprisonment. But the drama wasn't over. Not yet. I saw Charlie one more time on an afternoon during the final stages of the Shea Hinman trials. But by then the flamboyance was gone. He no longer looked like the high priest of flower power, but an embittered convict. He was seated in front of me, 20 feet away, just to my left beside his attorney. His head was shaved, the scar of the swastika stamped on his forehead. His jaw was dotted with a fine stubble. He looked old, worn out, beaten. Since the early days of the trials, much had happened. A major earthquake had rocked Los Angeles, killing 65 people. Spawn's movie ranch had burned to the ground. In less than 1 month of each other, Jimi Hendrix, September 18th, 1970, and Janis Joplin, October 4th, 1970, had OD'd on drugs, perhaps symbolizing the end of an era. Someone once said, all universes die. Looking at Charlie that afternoon, you got that feeling. Yet, when I took the stand, he looked up suddenly and just stared at me, a strange, half-leering smirk on his face. As I spoke, he just watched me, tilting his head from side to side as if he were an artist, attempting to get the right perspective for a painting. Maybe he was remembering, seeing as I had so many times, the arc of the circle we had made in time, the journey from one end of the human condition to the other, from a perfect dream into the bowels of a nightmare from which I had awakened just in time. I was in the midst of my testimony when Charlie suddenly lurched to his feet and shouted, "Liar! You're a liar! Order!" The gavel came down. But Charlie didn't stop. "No, no, little boy, you lie." Charlie was pulled to his seat, but his eyes were blazing, and I looked at him and held his gaze. And after a warning by the court, went on with my testimony. As I spoke, Charlie raised his finger, grinning, and slowly drew it across his throat. "You're pathetic, Charlie," I said. "Order." Then Charlie was standing again. "You're a liar," he roared. "No, Charlie, I'm telling the truth." "Order!" "Liar!" Charlie was pulled to his seat. Then I was standing, filled suddenly with emotion, a surging of rage, remorse, and utter revulsion. You made it all a lie. You calling me a liar proves it. Your whole trip has been a lie. Charlie struggled to his feet and began grappling with the bailiff, but I didn't stop yelling. "It's like you said. The truth will set you free. I know that." "Sit down, Mr. Watkins." "I speak the truth, Charlie." "Remove Mr. Manson from the courtroom." Charlie was seized by both arms, but he continued to kick and struggle. "You're just an insecure little boy," he shouted. "The truth, Charlie. The truth will set you free." They dragged Charlie out of the room. "Order! There will be order in this courtroom." The door closed, and I slumped into my seat. Epilogue. Ironically, the story of Charles Manson and his family does us all a favor. It reveals in no uncertain terms the disease of our own society. It chronicles the transformation of communal love into its opposite. There was nothing simplistic in what happened, and it wasn't something to turn away from. People seem to feign a horror of blood and carnage, yet invariably rush to accident scenes and fistfights, to anything that will put them in touch with their own blood and something that is primal, to something that will wake them up to the fact that they are not robots, but living, breathing organisms. The Manson family did more than this. It tore the lid off suburban complacency with a vengeance, and left us with a lot of questions to answer. I thought once the headlines and the novelty had worn off that the questions would cease, but as the days went on after the trials and the months turned into years, the questions continued. Even after the publication of Helter Skelter, it was clear that people did not understand what had actually transpired in the Manson family. During the trials, I was approached by producers Robert Hendrickson and Lawrence Merrick, who wanted to make a documentary film on the Manson family. They had already shot footage around spawns while Charlie was on trial, inducing the remaining family members to make music and rap about Charlie on film. The group obliged, believing not only that Charlie would be set free, but that they were helping to program Helter Skelter. Later, we shot some footage in Merrick's studio and in the desert. I hoped the film, Manson, would help explain what actually happened. It fell far short of the mark, but even so, won an award for the best documentary at the Venice Film Festival in 1974. Merrick signed the distribution rights over to American International Pictures, and he and I toured the country, premiering the film in Albuquerque, Chicago, and elsewhere. To me, the film seemed to be popular, but the company reported box office flops and legal problems, and it was virtually scrapped. After Helter Skelter hit the stands, I began touring with Vincent Bugliosi to promote the book on TV talk shows. I realized then that there was a genuine need to know what caused the phenomenon of the Manson family. I remember people asking me, "What can we do to protect our kids?" Often, I became the scapegoat for people's collective outrage. When I appeared on the Tom Snyder Tomorrow Show, his first question nearly floored me. "How is it that you are allowed to walk the streets and do this show?" Along with Bugliosi, I wasted no time in setting him straight. Why go through this? I questioned my own motives, realizing that deep down I did feel a sense of guilt. I had played a part and did have a responsibility to explain what had happened. After the Snyder Show, I got serious about public speaking and learned to handle myself under fire. I began giving lectures on the effects of drugs. I spoke at district attorneys' conventions and on college campuses. I pondered the idea of writing a book. In my own mind, I knew the Manson story had not really been told. With the exception of the Vietnam War, the Kennedy assassinations, the slaying of Martin Luther King, Watergate, and perhaps the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst, few events in the last 20 years have had more impact on the public at large than the story of Charles Manson and his family. People's fascination with death, violence, abduction, and money, it seems, can never be fully satiated, which says something about the public consciousness. Oddly enough, the Manson family originated as a rebellion against that very state of consciousness and was a direct outgrowth of the psychedelic revolution of the early 60s, grounded theoretically in principles of love and the freedom to be. What happened to those ideals, to me, and to the minds of Charlie's followers was the story I wanted to tell. The story of mind control and mental programming. The questions to be answered were crucial. The echoing refrain of a lady from Atlanta who asked me on the Phil Donahue show, "What experiences in your own background would make you susceptible to a man like Manson?" The woman appeared shocked when I told her we had shared many of her own experiences. Like her, we had shuddered through the Cuban Missile Crisis. We too cried for our country and the Kennedys. We watched in disgust while our natural inheritance turned into plastic and concrete, and bit our lips in rage as our brothers died in Southeast Asia. We saw movies on drugs made by people who knew nothing about drugs. We felt the need to live and to believe that we had inherited a world worth living in. So we hit the road in the mid-60s, searching for truth, hoping we might recognize it once we saw it. We needed to love and to be loved. One by one, we met Charlie and saw in him and his followers the love we were looking for. It has been too easy to classify the Manson family as a pack of sick, drug-bludgeoned kids duped by an ex-con. The transformation from a flower child family whose only revolutionary activity was an alternate lifestyle into a militant, helter-skelter-ready band of death-wielding robots was slow, methodical, insidious. Yet many still cling to the notion that all Charlie had to do to get people to kill was to stuff them full of dope and say sick 'em. Had that been the case, the interest in the Manson story should have waned long ago. No, Charles Manson was intelligent, and so were most of his followers. Hippies who wanted only to get laid or stoned were neither susceptible nor acceptable to Charlie. In conversation, he would lose the average Lodi as soon as he opened his mouth. People are still surprised when reminded that Sandy and Mary both had college degrees, that Leslie Van Houten was a homecoming queen and one of the most popular girls at Monrovia High School, that Katie was a Sunday school teacher, and so the list goes. How could it be that Tex Watson, who took part in so much killing, was not only an A student and a top athlete, but voted the most likely to succeed by his classmates in high school? No, Tex was programmed to kill, just as young soldiers are programmed to kill in the name of democracy or the flag or whatever. But in that case, it's just an all-American boy performing an heroic act. It's possible that had Tex gone into that kind of program, he would have been one hell of a Marine, a hero with decorations instead of a murderer in jail for life. It may be stretching the point, but it's one that should be made nevertheless. What drew us to Charlie initially was a real love we helped put there. So we submitted to his trip. We burned our bridges and left our pasts far behind, to become lost in Charlie's nightmare with nowhere to go. But Charlie always had the joint to go back to. The family didn't realize that he had a home and that the bridge to it could not be burned. Still, there are questions that remain unanswered. Just how and why did Charlie change? Did he have helter-skelter plan from the start? Or was it only a bud in his subconscious awaiting its time to flower? Only Charlie knows the answers to all the questions. But ultimately, he must be seen for what he was. The worst kind of criminal. A man who subverted the power of love, turning it into the most despicable evil imaginable, the domination of souls. Charlie did more than give hitchhikers and hippies a bad name. He manifested and expressed not only the mechanism of his own twisted psyche, but the latent evils existing within our own society. You cannot divorce Manson from the culture that spawned him. That, too, is an easy way out of what would be a grave error. I know that his incarceration has not put an end to my own struggles. It has taken years for me to untangle and come to grips with all that I experienced in the family. But more than anything, in the wake of all the destruction, the killing, the inner crippling of those who survived, I wanted to salvage something, if only the knowledge that what happened to the family could well have happened to others. That mind control and programming are a part of our daily lives, and that the results, unless people develop an awareness, can be, in the long run, no less insidious and destructive. Clearly, in a world where the majority of the populace speeds around in varied states of hypnosis, bombarded into stupor by the media, it is necessary to understand the fundamentals of programming. Perhaps if there is one lesson I have learned, it is to listen to myself, to be what I am. This is the bottom line of awareness, and paradoxically, the greatest link to humanity after all. Had I been grounded in March 1968, on the day I met Charles Manson, I would probably find it hard now to remember who he was. But the Manson saga is not over. In June 1977 and again in May 1978, I testified in Leslie Van Houten's retrials, each of which resulted in her reconviction. Whether or not she will appeal that conviction is not certain. I don't know what happened to all the others. I do know that Susan Atkins and Charles Watson, both born-again Christians, have written books about their experiences and are serving life sentences for their crimes, as are convicted murderers Bruce Davis, Mary Brunner, and Bobby Beausoleil. Annette Fromming is also in prison following her attempted assassination of former President Gerald Ford. Diane Lake, Snake, has been completely rehabilitated, and the last I heard, she was working as a teller in a bank in Northern California. As for Brooks, Juanita, Juan Flynn, and Crockett, all are doing well. Brooks is a full-time musician, while Juan lives in Panama, where he works on a ranch. Charles Manson, meanwhile, now 44, is serving a life sentence in California, awaiting his eligibility for parole. About the authors. Paul Watkins was the class president of all his high school classes in a suburb of Los Angeles and student body president in his senior year when he dropped out and took to the road. A series of circumstances led to his being picked up by two girls of the Manson family, and he soon became one of Manson's most devoted followers. Later, however, he became concerned about Manson's predilection for violence and left the family before the Tate murders. He now lives in the desert town of Tacoma, California, and earns his living in construction and by lecturing on the subject of drug prevention and rehabilitation. Guillermo Soldad is the pen name of a member of the faculty of the University of California at Santa Barbara. He has written a number of magazine articles for publications such as Miss, Playboy, and Playgirl. At this point, there is no more of the actual book to read. This part of the audio will be the scribe's additions to the original PDF version that I had found archived online. The scribe's note reads that all credit for this transcription is to Colonel Scott, who posted this book in its entirety on his blog, the official Tate LaBianca Murders blog at tatelabianca.blogspot.ca. Present scribe merely proofread, added illustrations, converted, and prepared his document for publication as a torrent. Although the work is copyrighted, it is presently strictly for educational purposes and in lawful accordance with the Fair Use Clause. This book is out of print and extremely hard to find and copy. Please keep this a free share in the pirate community, of which is something that I can only agree with. Personally, I was able to buy my copy of the book for $100 on eBay, which is kind of a lot for a book, but considering that Paul Watkins has passed away over 30 years ago, and there was never a second edition or printing of the book, it is what it is. Without the benefit of a hard copy of the book to scan images, the scribe elected to download images from the internet as a companion to the present volume. Enjoy. In the downloaded archived PDF that I originally found, there are pictures of Paul Watkins that at this point in the video I will include. There are pictures that you might have seen before and pictures that you might not have seen before. One of the last ones is a picture of Paul at the Manson film promotion. It reads, "The Hollywood producer-director of a documentary film about the Charles Manson family, Lawrence Merrick in the center, and a teenager who plays in Manson, Paul Watkins, right, are welcomed to Albuquerque by Lino Casamati, manager of Sunshine Theater. Manson showings are at Sunshine Theater." Now at this part of the end of the PDF, there are interviews with Paul Watkins. If there is a date listed, I will describe it. But for the most part, I really don't know when a lot of these might have taken place, though obviously it had to be somewhere around his book being published around 1978 and 1979, and before his death in 1990. The first interview is stated by Guillermo Soldad, photos by Charles Adams. Interview with Paul Watkins. 10 years ago, he was second in command in the Charles Manson family. Now he reviews that the real story behind the murders still hasn't been told. His voice is deep and resonant, his laughter infectious. He speaks articulately, yet without pretense. Charm. Paul Watkins has it. Not a frivolous, superficial charm, but an instinctive vitality grounded in exceptional intelligence and a keen sense of humor. At 28, he is a prosperous, self-educated, seasoned young man, a gifted composer and musician, a student of Gurdjieff, a miner of lapis lazuli, the last person in the world one would associate with Charles Manson. Yet, just a few short years ago, Paul was not only a member of the Manson family, but, as Charlie's second in command, perhaps closer to Manson than anyone else. One reason my wife and I moved out here to the desert was to escape the stigma of being associated with the family. But you never get away from something like that. People find out and you have to live with it. But we've been here several years and have made a good life and good friends. And I'm ready to talk about it now. In fact, I've done a book which will be published sometime this year. What inspires me is that people are as much interested in the Manson family today as they were just after the murders. I think it's because they sense the real story hasn't been told. Then they're right. With Flowers in Their Hair by Paul Watkins with Guillermo Soldad, Bantam Books. I'm still asked, weren't you shocked by the murders? Sure, I was shocked, revolted. But in many ways I understand it. I mean, I went through Charlie Manson's whole scene. Watkins left the family just 2 months before the Tate LaBianca murders. And I saw what happened from the inside. Tex, Charles Watson, Sadie, Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, Katie, Patricia Krenwinkel, and the others were my friends. I knew them as human beings, not monsters. What happened to them could have happened to a lot of people. Charles Manson was a powerful person who lost his positive energies to demons, then set those demons loose. It's an incredible story. Books like Helter Skelter and The Family only begin to explain what happened. It's time the whole story was told, and I can tell it. Paul Allen Watkins was born in Ventura County, California, on January 25, 1950, the third of 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. He spent his early childhood in Sidon, Lebanon, where his father worked on the pipeline. I learned Arabic as a child and grew up playing in the streets with Lebanese kids. I didn't start school until we moved back to the States. Quick-witted and gregarious, Paul enjoyed enormous popularity in school in Thousand Oaks, California, where he was elected president of every grade he attended from 1st through 11th. I was even elected student body president at the end of my junior year, but during the summer before my senior year, I got caught up in the hippie movement and dropped out of school. It seemed to me I had learned more that summer playing music and hitchhiking around the country, from Haight-Ashbury to New Mexico, than I did during all my years in school. I sensed something new was happening, that there was a new awakening of consciousness, and that the flower children of that time were a big part of it. That was 1967. A year later, I met Charlie Manson. I learned of Paul Watkins long before I met him by reading Helter Skelter. Shortly thereafter, I saw him interviewed on a television talk show and was not only impressed by his poise and presence under fire, but also deeply intrigued by what he said regarding the Manson family. When unexpectedly, months later, I was afforded the opportunity to meet him, I accepted at once. Appropriately enough, this meeting takes place on the outskirts of Death Valley, at a ranch where Paul now works as foreman and general handyman between musical appearances and treks to his lapis mine. I have driven 6 hours from the coast, and it is nearing dusk when I pulled off the highway onto a dust-blown gravel road. Watkins is waiting out front as I drive up and park in a swirl of powdery dust. Beside him is a large, black and brown, almost primordial-looking dog, Staffordshire Terrier, who bounds up to me as I get out of my van. "Down, Doob. Get down." "I'm Paul. You must be Guillermo." He grinned, shaking my hand. "This rascal is Doob." I'm struck by Watkins's classical good looks. His high cheekbones and strong, even features, highlighted by wide-set hazel eyes. As we walk toward the porch, chatting amiably, I am reminded of passages in Helter Skelter which depict Watkins as the family's #1 procurer of women. A lot of people expect me to be some goofy, spaced-out weirdo. When they find that I know a little something, it scares them even more, and they get defensive. What's really frightening them is a realization of their own potentialities and vulnerabilities. We enter the bungalow through a weathered screen door, leaving Doob on the porch. The building is constructed of pine wood and oak, housing the kitchen, dining room, and washroom facilities for the ranch. It has a laid-back bunkhouse atmosphere. Sitting down, I become instantly aware of the desert silence which pervades everything, clinging to the air like a substance while amplifying sounds of voices, footsteps, and the clatter of the coffee pot which Paul places on the burner before sitting across from me at the dining table. When I ask, he tells me briefly about the ranch and his duties as caretaker. Then he gets up to pour coffee, returning with 2 steaming cups before lighting a cigarette and lifting his chunky arms skyward to stretch. Short, stocky, and well-muscled. My family wanted me to be a jockey. He is built like a Mayan Indian, and I already sense that his physical compactness mirrors an inner solidity that is harmonious with his desert surroundings. I find it hard to associate him with Charles Manson. Yet, oddly enough, moments later, when he begins to discuss his early years with the family, I become distracted by my own uneasiness. Suddenly, the proximity of the man who was like a brother to Charles Manson begins to unnerve me slightly. In fairness to Paul, I tell him, I'm used to it. For a long time, even after we moved out here, people circulated petitions to get me thrown out. Lock up your daughters and valuables. Paul Watkins is in town. Can't really blame them, I guess. They flash on the horrors of the murders in that demonic mug shot of Charlie that was plastered all over magazines and newspapers. What I resent, though, is that the media has pulled me several times, setting me up on national TV, like when I appeared on the Tom Snyder Show with Vincent Bugliosi, co-author of Helter Skelter, supposedly to discuss the Manson family. I mean, these people knew I had nothing to do with the murders. Yet, the first question out of Snyder's mouth is, why do they let someone like you walk the streets? It even shocked Bugliosi. I don't make those appearances anymore. What disturbs a lot of people is that they expect me to be some goofy, spaced-out weirdo. When they find out that I have brains and know a little something, it scares them even more, and they get defensive. What's really frightening them is an unconscious realization of their own potentialities and vulnerabilities. The people in Manson's family were not dumb weirdos. Most of them, in fact, were intelligent and creative, which indicates that Charlie had to be pretty sharp and creative to manipulate them. I interject that while Manson may have been creative in some respects, he proved himself one of the most destructive criminals in history. That's right, sure, Charlie lost it. He became a murderer, but we don't know him as a killer. You see, the public never met Charlie afresh as we did. When I met him in the spring of 1968, there was no violence in the air. No talk of Helter Skelter. In fact, it was the complete opposite. I met Manson with flower power and hippie love was still blooming. It had some integrity. It was real. All the violence was in Vietnam or in the ghettos. But the public met Charlie through the media only after the murders. By then, the whole story was tainted with blood. To understand Charlie Manson and the family, you have to see how they evolved. You have to make that journey from one end of the spectrum to another. You might look at it this way. Anyone with all the negative energy and power that Charlie obviously possessed also had an equal share of its opposite, positive energy. Can you imagine all the horror and violence of Charles Manson turned to love? Well, that's how it was in the beginning, and that's what people were drawn to. People read Helter Skelter and see the movie and gore and immediately dismiss Manson as a psycho who used drugs and sex to program a bunch of young kids. Sure, there's an element of truth in that, but what they don't see is the important thing: how it happened. What transpired during those programming sessions. What happened to individuals within the family during the year before the murders? To Tex and Sadie. To everyone. How did they change? How did Charlie change? How did I change? What happened in the family wasn't just sex, drugs, and violence. There was a beauty there, too. And while it might sound absurd to some people, a lot of good may yet come from the experience of the Manson family once people understand it. Only now do I really have a perspective on it myself. Sure, it was a tragedy that innocent people and an unborn child were killed. No one will deny that. But there are equally grisly tragedies happening all the time, less sensational and well publicized, some insidiously subtle in fact. But tragedies nevertheless. That's why people should understand what really took place. Watkins sits forward in his chair, gripping his coffee cup with both hands. He is a born storyteller. There is an intensity when he speaks, a fusion of voice, gesture, and exuberance that rivets the listener's attention. I mean, we're all victims of programming to one degree or another, he continues. To me, it's a crime to see an 18-year-old Marine programmed to hate gooks or Japs and to kill them with a bayonet in the name of democracy or the flag or whatever. But in that case, it's just an all-American boy performing a heroic act. It's possible that had Tex Watson gone into that kind of program, he'd have been one hell of a Marine, a hero with decorations, instead of a murderer in jail for life. And to the garbage on TV, programming people all the time, hour after hour, to wear certain clothes, eat certain foods, buy products which further pollute the earth, programmed by pretty, sexy people and little musical jingles. Sex and music, the same elements Charlie employed in the family. Maybe the comparison is stretching things slightly, but it's something to be aware of. Though people talk about it, a few of them really see it. Or, what's worse, they see it and don't care. That's the subtlety of it. It works beneath your level of awareness until you walk into a store and automatically pick up a certain kind of food. When I point, the next word seems to be bleached out, so I don't know what it is. I'm assuming of or to. That picking up a knife to commit murder and a can of soup are two different things. Paul nods with a smile. That's why I left the family. But it was tough. Charlie had a strong hold on me too. His techniques were effective and very deceptive. His trip was to program people to submit, to give up their ego, which, in a spiritual sense, is a lofty aspiration. As rebels with a materialistic, rather decadent culture, we could dig it. It was particularly attractive to me since I have always been a spiritually oriented person, and I was a student of the Bible. But generally, the girls were more easily programmed than the guys. It was easier for them to submit. They didn't have as far to fall, as much ego to drop off. They'd already been programmed into a form of submission by society. Yet, in a way, by submitting, they became superior to the guys. Like when it came to accepting their bodies, being naked, etc., they were far more comfortable and confident than the men. Charlie taught them to love their bodies. Look at yourself, he'd say. Touch yourself. That's not a foreign country, that's your body. All of it. It's like a plant. If you don't give it love, it will die. Get to know it and love it. And ultimately, without saying so, give it to me. Obviously, his attitude toward women was pretty one-dimensional. But within that dimension, they were strong and more liberated than most women of that time, even ones who thought they were hip. I asked Paul about his role as procurer of women of the family. That's partly true. Charlie was older, and it was easier for girls to come to Charlie through the younger guys, and the girls liked me. But in most cases I'm portrayed as some second-class hippie pimp, which isn't true. It just so happened that I got into the program with a lot of enthusiasm. I was intrigued from the start. I always wondered, how does this little guy do it? Even though I believed in Charlie, I always had a sense of myself as separate, a sense of my own ego. In a way, I was like a student learning from the master, 'cause Charlie was like a little guru. He had knowledge and intensity, and in the beginning, a lot of beauty. Also, let's face it, I needed sex education. Really. It was good therapy. I was 18, and what could be better than a house of willing and able young ladies? You were almost forced to get over your inhibitions. Like if someone was uncomfortable sitting around naked, Charlie would make them get up, bend over, and spread the cheeks of their ass. Crack a smile, he'd say. Get down with us. Get funky. If you're uptight, get it over with. Everyone's got an asshole. No one's got anything to hide. We're all one. I am you and you are me. That kind of thing. And it worked. But it was never perverted in the way people have been led to believe. The idea that we indulge in hedonistic, satanic ceremonies and orgies just isn't true. We were sincere, trying to put together a transcendental sexual experience, trying to harmonize and fuse the sexual energies of the family. We had nothing to do but make love, and we wanted to make loving a full spiritual experience. Obviously, it was an awesome undertaking with so many people, and it never really worked too well. He laughs. You can imagine the kinds of things that happened, particularly in the beginning. People sitting around naked and self-conscious, wanting very badly to pull off this cosmic sexual trip for Charlie. But the realities are that one guy's worried about getting a hard-on or the size of his prick, and this girl doesn't like her tits, or there's some hot dog in the corner who wants to ball his brains loose, or someone else is frigid. Not to mention other deeper psychological hang-ups and traumas that surface along the way. It took time to get people to the point where they even felt comfortable being naked around each other. I asked him to elaborate on these family sex sessions. Usually, after dinner, we'd all be sitting around in a circle listening to Charlie rap. Then we'd make music for an hour or two. Charlie on the guitar, the rest of us singing. Maybe somebody would play the sitar. Then a few of the girls would pass around some grass or a little hash to smoke. Generally, we'd start by everyone just making any kind of noise he wanted, just to let it all out. And there'd be a loud cacophony which would finally subside into a drone. Then Charlie would start a game called The Circle, transmitting motion by joining hands and passing the motion around the group. We'd all focus on turning off the internal dialogue and just get into the rhythm and vibrations of the motion. Gradually, Charlie would start programming in sexual energy by touching or feeling the person next to him, and this would be passed along. From that point, we'd progress to positions on the floor, touching each other, trying to get a harmonious sense of energy flowing. Charlie would usually direct things more or less by using sign language or movements. Since there were always fewer males, the women would get off by tuning into each other, trying to get into the rhythm of the whole group. Sometimes small segments, say 4 or 5 people, would get a really nice thing going, but it never really worked out so well that we all had a simultaneous orgasm, which is what we were striving for. Just too many people, too many trips going on. Invariably, people would start going through some heavy number, an ego death of some kind, and we'd have to help the person through it. Talk about sensitivity training. But Charlie taught the fundamentals of sex too. We always had our sights on a kind of transcendental tantric sex, but he got us down to the nitty-gritty. Like, if someone didn't know how to give head, he'd just ask one of the girls to lie down and spread her legs, and he'd point out the clitoris like a friggin' anatomy teacher and give you a lesson then and there. No doubt about it, sex was fundamental to the programming of the family. I mean, if you can teach someone how to make love or make them believe you taught them, you have a lot of power over that person. Everything revolved around making love and submitting was a form of death, since it meant giving up the ego. Like I mentioned earlier, we were always acting out our deaths or watching Charlie act them out. So you have these words together all the time. Making love and death. Death becomes beautiful since it releases you to love. You realize the extremes it can teach you when you consider that Sadie actually had an orgasm while committing murder. Plus, the act of stabbing has such obvious sexual connotations, and the victims were stabbed many times. It really gives you the willies. There's another aspect too. Oops. Charlie used to say that the soul doesn't hear don't. He said that no and don't were contrary to nature in the cosmos. Life is yes and do. That when people say no, they really mean yes. The implications later were that if you attack or threaten someone and they say no, they really mean just the opposite. Pretty sick irony. A man who commits murder talking about going against the life force. But that's how it was with Charlie. Everything was a paradox. Did Charlie get angry very often? Yeah. He got angry and radical sometimes, but again, it was a paradox since he could also get very patient and gentle. A lot more patient than the rest of us. I guess it was something he developed in prison. I imagine after 2/3 of your life behind bars, you learn a little patience. For example, there were times when there'd be a delay or we'd have to wait in line someplace. Charlie would rarely get uptight. He'd just find a stick or a rock on the ground and turn it into some kind of toy or game. Or he'd start talking to a kid in the street and get the kid into the game. But it was really beautiful the way he'd get so absorbed in it. And it impressed the family and gave more credence to what he preached about coming to now and being absorbed in the moment. But yeah, he got angry too, even violent. Like he got pretty rough on the girls now and then, slapped them around. At times they even seemed to thrive on it. I think they carried around a lot of guilt, so that unconsciously they felt they deserved punishment. Most people are like that, in part. It's the whole trip Christianity lies on you. I would guess, looking back on it, that the family, unconsciously, was as much attracted to Charlie's negative, violent side as they were to his warm, loving side. Generally, people fear their own negative feelings and are afraid to release anger. And let's face it, we can all store up a lot, particularly if we don't have an outlet. You don't have to be in prison to store up anger. There are lots of people who would like to throw their anger into a cause of some kind. Charlie gave people a cause. It didn't always make sense, but then anger is a passion and doesn't have to make sense. Like Charlie would always say, no sense makes sense. You have to remember that the transition toward violence within the Manson family was gradual. In the beginning, everyone was geared to making love and music. A peaceful, closely knit group just being together in love. It wasn't until we moved from Spawn's Ranch to Death Valley, then back to LA again, that things got heavy. About 6 months before the Tate LaBianca murders, at about the same time the Beatles' White album came out, and Charlie started spouting Helter Skelter, the war between the blacks and the whites. By then, we were committed to helping promote the revolution through music, hoping to program the young people to come to the desert. That's when we started buying dune buggies and tied in with the motorcycle gangs and ex-cons. We felt we were at the forefront of what was about to come down. but there was no talk of us committing murders. Charlie had described how the revolution, helter-skelter, would begin. That the blacks would go on a rampage, murdering people in their homes, and that this would trigger a race war which the blacks would inevitably win. While the war raged, we would arm ourselves and be prepared, but would wait it out in the desert, ready to take over when the war ended. I asked Paul, "Didn't you start having a few doubts by that time?" "Yeah, I had doubts, but you see, all along the way, Charlie had built up his credibility, and the family had grown and had been reinforced by mere numbers. You just got used to him being right. If you ever started to doubt something Charlie said, you just look around and see everyone else agreeing, and just figure you might be wrong. In fact, it got to be a joke of sorts among the members of the family. Seeing someone new come in, we'd say, 'Watch, they'll fall into the hole,' meaning that the person would dig what Charlie was saying, would become enlightened, so to speak. When I suggest that falling into a hole connotes the misfortune rather than enlightenment, Paul nods with a smile. I know, it's that paradox again. It has a lot of meanings, actually. Like, for us, the hole was the void, or a kind of free place to be. Also, the hole has obvious sexual connotations and can be thought of as the womb. You can also think of it as the whole, W-H-O-L-E. But there were always these opposites at work. Instead of getting high, we'd always get down to the basics. The hole is down, but it's the only way up, too. Pretty soon you don't know up from down, black from white. I guess that's the way Charlie wanted it. Paul gets up and brings the coffee pot to the table. He fills up my cup first. I broke with Charlie not because of his basic philosophy, but when all the positive energy turned destructive and evil, when Charlie finally said to me, "We're gonna show Blackie how to get helter-skelter started," I knew just what he meant, and that's when I split for the desert. But it was tough. My ties were strong, not only to Charlie, but to the family. I needed help from the outside to break away. Crockett was the prospector I met out in the desert. He had a major influence on me, kind of a bridge to the other side of the chasm. That's a whole story in itself, what happened with Paul Crockett and his confrontations with Charlie in the desert. Some incredible scenes, and most of them have never been described. The whole period during the time of the trials and my getting burned in the van was pretty damned traumatic. The law was on me to testify. The family wanted to be sure I supported Charlie. There were all kinds of trips going down. You have to remember that for over a year I had been the number 2 male in the family. I was close to these people. In a way, I was like a roving brother therapist to everyone, talking to the girls, listening to complaints, patching up disputes, keeping things together whenever Charlie was gone. I mean, these people were my brothers and sisters. Helter Skelter is a book about murderers, but I didn't know these people as murderers. I knew them as people. My book will show them as human beings. Also, my link with Charlie was strong because I was his most trusted man. Up until I left the family, I was the only male who could handle his programs. The sex, the drugs, and the music. For me, though, the music was by far the strongest bond. The first night I met Charlie in Topanga Canyon, before I had even talked to him, we played music, improvised songs, and had a great time. Later, we worked on our music within the family and did some dynamite stuff. Even after his arrest, I was hustling around to get our music promoted. I'm sure, too, Paul says, moments later, the fact that Charlie and I are almost exactly the same size played a big role in our relationship. Unconsciously, it must have affected the girls. Relating to men of the same size, living with them, making love with them. In a way, Charlie would leave me in charge without removing his own physical presence. Also, I was 18 when I met Charlie, and he was 35. Old for the hippie world. Physically, I embodied the flower child to a T. Young, strong, full of enthusiasm. Plus, I pretty much absorbed Charlie's philosophy and carried out his programs. In a way, I did become Charlie, or perhaps he became part of himself through me. I was like his mirror, reflecting the budding flower child he was seeking to become. I think when I left the family, it caused a kind of psychological split in Charlie, or at least catalyzed that split. The flower child in him was actually departing. The love, music, and all the happiness I may have represented was leaving him. Leaving him with what he really was. An aging ex-convict with a lot of bitterness and rage. In fact, the last thing he said to me before I left for the desert was, "The love thing is over. It's helter-skelter all the way." It's after midnight when Paul looks up the bungalow and we head across the yard toward one of the guest houses. I stop to grab my sleeping bag from the back of the van, then run to catch up with Paul and Doob, still thinking of questions I want to ask. Questions which will not be fully answered until his book is published. The air is crisp and cold, the night brilliant with stars over the valley. The only sounds are our shoes crunching against the ground and Doob's panting as he trots ahead of us. But my mind returns to Charlie Manson, and I ask Paul what he thinks of Manson now. Charlie blew it. He turned a thing of beauty into something grotesque. I haven't seen him for years, but I'm sure he has lost his power. When someone has that kind of power and they abuse it or pervert it, the power turns self-destructive or goes away. It's a law of karma. I knew when I last saw him during the trials that the power was gone. That, for me, all that had been good was gone. The second article, titled Book Bin by Larry Rumley. He ran with the Manson family but left before the shambles. Paul Watkins is 29, trim and muscular, involved in gem mining and music. Into music since he was 8, he said in a Seattle visit. He plays French horn, trumpet, and is now into reeds. My old group was the Desert Sons, but now I'm forming a new group, he said. Not too unusual a background, perhaps, but Watkins has lived a lot of experience in his brief span, and My Life with Charles Manson, Bantam Books, $2.25. He spells it out. Fortunately for Watkins, though, at one time he was number 2 man in the notorious family, most of whose members are serving life sentences for the ghastly Tate LaBianca murders in 1969. He left the family prior to that time, but he provides insight into the family that Charles Manson formed and kept in line through fear and intimidation. Lie, Tex, Charles Watson, high school football hero and good student before his Manson link, Katie, Patricia Krenwinkel, Sadie, Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, Clem, Steve Grogan, and others before they became murderers. Manson, who had never known love, served jail terms on a variety of charges before, in 1967, he left jail for San Francisco during the development of the flower children culture with so many receptive young people at hand. Manson began organizing his own family, which would be bonded by love. This was 9 months before he and Watkins met. In the early days at Spawn Ranch in Southern California, where Manson and his group established their base, there was no indication of hostility or anything other than communal life with good vibes. There seems to be a part missing, or the context of this doesn't exactly make sense, but the next part says, couldn't get his music published, became more erasable when the ranch was invaded by bikers, the mood turned more and more angry, and Manson became obsessed with the possibility of racial war. The helter-skelter, he predicted, was coming down. Among other influences that worked for Watkins was meeting an older man, Paul Crockett, a loner who lived on adjoining property, working a mining claim. Crockett, about 44 at the time, had a stabilizing influence on Watkins. His quiet philosophy proved a counterforce to Manson's increasingly antisocial attitude. Of Crockett, Watkins said simply, he knew when to talk, when to keep quiet. He was just interested in what you had to say, what you were thinking. After Watkins made his break simply changing messiahs, it's harder to get back to basic causes, to find your basic self. To reassess, I thought I was in the vanguard of new ideas, a way out. It took Crockett to help straighten me out. After some of the others, Watkins said, know how Manson could attract followers so easily. Watkins said during his appearance on Chicago's Phil Donahue show, a woman asked what made him susceptible and was shocked, he said, when he replied that he had shared some of her own experiences. I'm unsure if there's more to that interview, but that seems to be the only part to that article of which there's still context missing. Beyond that, there's nothing else to this book, nor the PDF. The end of the PDF states, My Life with Charles Manson, mass market paperback, 278 pages. The publisher is Bantam Books, 1979. Language, English. ISBN 10-055-31-27-888. ISBN 13-978-055-31-27-881. The back of my book, the physical copy, states, it can be explained. I can explain it. Once, Charles Manson's number 2 man, Paul Watkins believed in the family and trusted Manson with his life. That was before the Tate LaBianca murders, before the warning signals that Helter Skelter was coming down. Now, in My Life with Charles Manson, he recalls with chilling, hour-by-hour detail how he came to join the Manson family, and how, from the beginning, they were programmed by sex, drugs, and music to kill and die for a man who would as easily have cut their throats. He describes the creepy, crawly nights, which were rehearsals for murder, and Manson's richly embroidered ceremonial vest, which depicted scenes of family life and was woven partly in human hair. My Life with Charles Manson is a story of violence against a body, mind, and soul. Perhaps the most shocking story ever told.